Today was one of those days where I would say that the Holy Spirit tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, you better do something now. I was in a today was one of those days where I would say that the Holy Spirit tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, you better do something now. I was in a studio recording, and at a certain point, I just felt the urge of sending a message to Mr. Kalifungwa with two questions, just to make sure. One is, what time exactly does this event begin? The chapel. And then the other was just make sure that I had prepared on the right text. Yeah, thankfully, the second one was correct. I had prepared on the right text. The problem was on the first, because I was thinking the chapel begins at 12:30. And when he told me it was 11:45, yeah, we stopped recording immediately. And I jumped into the vehicle and made a beeline here. So I'm really grateful that whatever promptings I got from God, I responded by sending a message. I honestly don't know why I thought it was 12:30, because I've preached here so many times. So I'm really grateful that I am here on time. We are looking at chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, beginning with verse 17. But as usual, it's always good to have context. So I'll begin from verse 12, and then I'll end somewhere around verse 28 and verse 29. Okay, but what we are looking at is chapter 7, verse 17 to verse 24, and I'm calling it Priorities for Healthy Believers. Priorities for healthy believers. Beginning with verse 12. Now, the context, I'm sure you know. Paul is writing to the Corinthians about marriage. And he's not so much writing to them about, what we normally refer to as premarital counseling, sort of preparing people for marriage, but he's writing into a situation. And the situation, as you might very well appreciate, is that there were new believers in Corinth. Some of them were already in courtship. They had already gone through formal engagement, which we Africans would understand. It's not simply that somebody knelt down with an engagement ring in his hand to say, will you? But rather, they went through the process of taking plates. You understand taking plates, eh? Some of you are looking rather lost. Okay, where two families meet and go between talk, and they are charged the lobola and everything. Okay, so it's formal engagement. They had gone through all those things, and so they were now wondering what to do, because they were believers already. What should they do? Should they give up the plans for marriage altogether? Should they proceed and get married? What should they do? It was quite confusing because it was all very new. So I begin from verse 12. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. So in this particular case, it's individuals who've already gone past actual marriage. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, that's already been handled by a previous speaker. I suspect it might have even been Pastor Kalifungwa, but okay, people are nodding their heads here. So let's proceed to the section I'm dealing with. Verse 17. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. That's the basic thesis of all that we are looking at in this passage. Because you notice it also in verse 20, and you will notice it also in verse 24. And what we say about the Bible is that when something is being repeated a number of times, then it's a major point that we need to keep in mind. Paul goes on to say, this is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. And again, there it is in verse 20, each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. And then he gives another example. Were you a bond servant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freed man of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You who were bought, rather you were bought with a price, do not become bondservants of men. And then that statement again. So brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. And now to just add the next part for context purposes. Now concerning the betrothed, which is what I talked about earlier. I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. Well, brethren, what we're really looking at here in the section that we have before us is the Apostle Paul basically wanting us to have spiritual priorities in the present condition in which we are. Now, right now, I'm speaking to individuals who are largely students and also largely single. So when I come to apply, I'm going to apply to those two areas where you are single and you are a student. And in terms of priorities, I've already laid the cat out of the bag. The concern of the Apostle Paul is that we might have real spiritual priorities in the condition in which we currently are. And so he begins with those words in verse 17, that this is the rule that he gives in all the churches. And it is this: let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. The basic point there being that God is sovereign. And in his sovereignty, he has dispensed situations, times, seasons in our individual lives. We are not like what I call products of a Chinese factory. In other words, all of us being exactly the same, going through situations in life in exactly the same way. We are not like that. Each one of us, God deals with us completely differently. So, for instance, some of us may have begun school very early, others begin school late. Some of us would have been in the same class, in the same year with our friends, then something happens, maybe our parents were unable to pay, and consequently we remain behind. Our friends end up going ahead of us. Exactly the same with respect to work. Some of us end up getting employed very quickly, while others take longer to get a job. Similarly, with respect to marriage, others, even before they finish university, they're already married. Others, another 10 years, and spouses are not showing up. It's completely different, the way in which God deals with us. And even in the workplace, it is like that. You find that you are working with your friends, your friend gets promoted. And before you know it, bang, 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 your friend is your manager. But you started work together. Again, it's God who deals with us severally. And all that Paul is saying here is that we should learn to accept the providence that God has given us at that point, so that we are not individuals who are being vexed by where we are, so that we are no longer relevant to where we are at that point, because we can't wait to move on to something else. And he's saying, this is the rule that I give to all the churches, that individuals should learn to serve the Lord in the state in which they currently are. So he gives two examples. The first example that he gives is that of circumcision. Okay? He's applying it to circumcision. And the way he applies it is this way. He says, was anyone at the time of his call? Now, you'll notice that even in verse 17, he spoke about to which God has called him. And there, all he's speaking about there is, in the first one, it's the state in which you are at that point in your life. And when he now comes, was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? He's speaking there not so much the call to ministry as the call to what? Salvation. Okay? When the Lord brought you to himself, what was your condition there? So for these people, I want to repeat, they were young converts. When I say young converts, I don't mean they were teenagers, but they had just become Christians. So when he's saying, was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? It's a very recent thing that they could be able to speak about. And he's saying, if that's the case, let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. And then, in other words, to try and reverse anything concerning his circumcision. And was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Again, he's saying, let him not seek circumcision. In other words, don't make a big issue of wanting to be circumcised so that it becomes like the major thing that is dominating your life. You're even fretting about it. He's saying, don't. Why? Well, he gives the answer here. Neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision. What matters in life is keeping the commandments of God. That's what matters. Ultimately, these are simply physical things that are being done to your body. They don't bring you closer to God. They don't take you far away from God. Therefore, keep that which matters the most. And it is this, that I am living my life today according to God's will. Today, according to God's will. That is what really matters, he says. And so he comes back to that statement. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Okay, I hope we understand. What he has done is given us an example that for these people would have been a very real thing in Corinth in the Bible days, primarily because of the Jew-Gentile divide. And often, with respect to the Jews, it was the done thing that you would be circumcised so early in life. Well, he then takes on another example, which would be more applicable to the Gentile world, but was also true in the Jewish world. And it is that of slavery. Now, the ESV uses the word bond servant, simply because of the fact that, it's trying to apply to a context, a culture where slavery is dehumanized completely, and it is not the done thing. So instead of limiting it to those days, it then speaks about a servant who is bonded, because we are able to understand a servant. Okay? And in us here, in African context as well, we would be primarily thinking in terms of servants. But really, the actual word there is doulos, which is an actual slave. Okay? So were you a slave when you were called? And again he's saying, do not be concerned about it. All he's saying again there is don't fret. Don't turn it into such a major issue that is now dominating your life as to whether you are a slave or you are not. And then he adds, but if you can gain your freedom, because slaves were actually bought, and so they had no freedom to live in that sense. If you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. Okay, in my version, that's in brackets. And it's correctly in brackets, because it's a passing thing. What he's saying there is, fine, I'm not suggesting that you must remain there whether you like it or not, because obviously there are some benefits you gain for not being a slave. So if you can get it, that's okay. But again, he comes back to the same point. Don't make it the main issue of your life. Verse 22. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant, in other words, who got saved but is a slave, is a freedman of the Lord. So, spiritually speaking, you have been liberated from bondage to Satan, liberated from bondage to the world, liberated from bondage to sin. You are, in actual fact, a free person, spiritually speaking. Likewise, he who was free, in other words, who wasn't a slave at the point of salvation, when called, is a slave. This time is a slave to Christ. And he argues the point in verse 23, you were bought with a price, do not become bond servants of men. Okay, so the point again there is that when you are trying to make a big issue about whether you're a slave or not a slave, the truth of the matter is we are all free, and we are all what? Slaves. Those of us who are Christians, we are slaves of Christ. And so he ends up again in verse 24 with that phrase that we've already seen. So brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. What matters is that where you are now, whatever condition you are in now, you are with the Lord. You are walking with Him. You are living in obedience to Him. You are fulfilling your calling in life. So that's what Paul is generally speaking about here. And it's a general principle that can be applied in every sector. For instance, if I can go back some 50 plus years ago, when Zambia was under colonial rule, when the Pan-Africanism was sweeping right across the continent, and African leaders were demanding that we should have our freedom from colonial masters, whether it's Spain or England or France or whatever it might be. It became the dominant thought in people's minds that we must get our freedom. And church life became literally impossible, because most of the pastors then were white. And therefore, church members were taking what is happening out in the world and bring it in the church. And they basically saying, why are you the pastor here? Eh? We want freedom. Freedom. And so missionaries were being basically forced to resign, pack their bags and leave. And churches were being left that were completely immature. They did not have the leadership to take them forward. Why? Because people were just absorbed with this freedom thing. Well, in the process, of course, Paul would be saying, fine, if you can get your freedom, get it. But he would add, but don't make it the main issue of your lives. So that in the end, you postpone real spiritual evangelism, discipleship, and all that needs to happen in obedience to God, because you've got only one mind: independence. We must become independent. Because in the end, Paul would say, yeah, those people who are independent in France, in America, in Spain, wherever else it might be, they are also what? Thank you. They are also what? Slaves, yes. They are slaves. Spiritual slaves in many ways. So, in truth, as important as these things might look like, they are not really more important than your actual spiritual well-being. Okay, let's apply this in two quick areas, and then I must close, because almost all of you in here, 95%, were not there in 1964. So there's no point making that the chief application. You were not throwing any stones at missionaries, unless you were kicking in your mother's womb like this, throwing stones inside there. But let's apply it to the realm of being students. The realm of being students. Because it's very easy for you, again, to be thinking that I will really begin serving the Lord after I graduate. I will really only consider what it means to walk with the Lord seriously after I graduate. And therefore, right now, the only thing you want to be absorbed with are grades. That's all. Grades. So that I can finally get out of this place, and when I get out of this place, I've got my degree, then I can look around and say, okay, now God, what is it that you want me to do? Again, it's that absorption that the Apostle Paul is saying here. Don't be like that. That's the point he's making. Do not be like that. You must have the priorities of a healthy believer. That even now, while I am a student, let me seriously consider the demands of God upon my life. Now, this is the time to do so. Again, another area that individuals tend to think about is in terms of being single or being married. Again, it's the same thing. You know, after I get married and we settle down, then I will begin to see how together we can serve the Lord and so on. Again, the point that Paul is making here is don't postpone serious spiritual issues. Rather, in the now, that should be your priority. The now, that's the time that you say, I am going to live a life of genuine obedience. I'm going to live a life of genuine service for the Lord. Now, for these people, I suppose if I was preaching in a context beyond students, if it was just generally in a church, I was going to add not just are you single, but also individuals who might be in an unequal yoke marriage. An unequal yoke marriage. In other words, where they are saying, maybe when my wife gets saved or my husband gets saved, then we're going to really serve the Lord. Then I will give myself to true obedience to the Lord. But since I got converted and my husband or my wife is not converted, I'm waiting until it happens, then. Or another situation could be, assuming I'm talking to a more general context, is if you are in a difficult marriage. Sometimes a difficult marriage does not just mean it's an unbeliever. Because some Christians are difficult. Saved, yes, but difficult. Again, it's the same thing. You could be saying, Lord, once you've dealt with my wife's heart, or once you've dealt with my husband's heart, and the person stops being difficult, then that's when I'm going to live for you and really save you and so on. Again, the application here from the Apostle Paul is no. Make your life for God full now. Back to the area of being a student. It's easy for us to think like this, that, while I'm in my parents' home, I can't really be somebody who's going to be committed to the Lord and his ways until after I'm free, I've left my parents' home and so on. That's when I'm going to start really living for the Lord and everything else to do with him, in obedience to him. Again, the answer is no. For now, the Lord, this is what he has assigned to you. Yes, your friends may have already moved on. They may have already left their parental homes. They may have already stopped being students. They've graduated. They've moved on to something else. Some of them didn't even go through college or university. They just went straight into the working world. Maybe your friends have even already gotten married or have married. God assigns to each one of us, in his own time, in his providence, the circumstances in which we are. And therefore, our task is to make sure that there we are actively serving him. Now, strictly speaking, the two examples that Paul gives are examples that are not easy to change. They're not easy. I mean, if you are uncircumcised, yes, you can change easily in terms of getting circumcised. But if you are circumcised already, I mean, the reverse is next to impossible. Or slavery. You know, if it's employment, you can easily resign, isn't it? You can just say you can keep your salary and just write a job, I've resigned, with immediate effect, and you leave. But if you're a slave and you say, I've resigned, your slave master just laughs at you. And just says, stupid, you just go to work. That's it. Okay. In other words, the examples Paul uses are meant to emphasize the fact that often the situations of our lives are not easy to change. And our worrying and our anxiety and our fretting is nothing more than what one calls an opportunity cost. That's all it is. You're not actually gaining anything by the amount of thinking that you're putting into all this and so on, the worrying, the anxiety, the fretting, the frustration, and it's not adding anything to your life. Because ultimately, that change is only in the hands of God. It's only in the hands of God. That's why he's saying, stop it. Stop wasting your nervous energy in what you can't change. Stop it. That's really what he's saying here. And the reason why he's saying it is this, that the opportunity cost is this. You are losing the opportunity to serve the Lord. That's what you're doing. You are losing that while you are fretting, you are losing the opportunity to serve him. And trust me, friends, time lost is never regained. Never. I've never forgotten this when I was at secondary school. We were in what we used to call Form 5 those days. Today we call it grade 12. And our head teacher stood in front of us. All of us who were at that time equal to grade 12. And he said to us, guys, a lot of you are still playing. But listen to me. Every day you don't study is getting you closer to the exam, and that day will never be given back to you. I've never forgotten. It sank into me like lead into water. It sank. That every day that I allow past is like water that has gone under the bridge. You can't bring it back. It's gone. So every day you spend worrying about whether you're circumcised or not circumcised, whether you're a free man or you are a slave, whether you are single or married, whether you are a student instead of being a worker, whether you're in your parents' home and instead of being independent. All this time that you are vexed with all these things, and that's what you are primarily thinking about. You are losing opportunities to serve the Lord and consequently to invest into heaven. And your youthfulness, your today, will soon be past. To be gone. To be gone. So this is the time for you to say, for now, these are the circumstances the Lord has allowed me to be in. For now. Therefore, let me prioritize my relationship with him and my service to him. Is that your attitude about your life today? Is that your attitude? Are you today bearing fruit for Jesus Christ? Today, are you? Or is this something you've postponed because of some other agenda items that might even be completely out of your control? May God help each one of us to have healthy spiritual priorities now, not tomorrow, now, for the good of his world, for the glory of God. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, thank you for your word, which has application to us thousands of years later, that each one of us should lead the life that you have assigned us for the now, seeking to walk with you, seeking to live in obedience to you. Oh God of heaven, help us to do just that for Jesus' sake. Amen.